So this video is reviewing the anatomy of the forearm, wrist, and hand. It's important to remember that we have a strong correlation between the forearm, wrist, and hand and the elbow. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap, and there are a lot of muscles here that cross the elbow that are synergists at the elbow as well. So as we're going through, just keep the elbow in mind. We'll start with the radius and the ulna. It's important to remember that the radius and the ulna are kind of inverse in shape. So while the ulna is wider and kind of the predominant forearm bone at the elbow, the radius is the wider and more predominant forearm bone in the wrist. The radius is always on the side of the thumb. So here we see the radius, and then we see the thinner ulna over on the other side. So we have two different kind of sections on both the radius and the ulna. We have the radial head and the ulnar head, which is the area kind of just past this growth plate line that you can see here. And then distal to the radial and the ulnar head, we have these styloid processes. So these are the two little pieces that kind of extend down around the carpals. And again, we call that the radial styloid on the radius and the ulnar styloid on the ulna. We have several joints that are affiliated with the radius and the ulna. In between the two, here we have the distal or radial ulnar joint. And then between the radius and the carpals, we have what we call the radiocarpal joint, which is our wrist joint. So moving distally into the wrist and the hand, down at the very bottom we have our carpals. Again, these are the small bones that make up the wrist. Our radius would sit here and our ulna would sit here. Between the radius and the carpals, we have our radiocarpal joint. And then in between each of the carpals, we have what we call midcarpal or intercarpal joints. Continuing distally into the hand, the first section of bones that we have in the hand is our metacarpals, and these are the bones that exist kind of through your palm and the back of your hand. So between the carpals and the metacarpals, we have a joint that's called the carpometacarpal joint. Continuing to move distally, the next section of the fingers that we have is the proximal phalanges. And the joint that exists between the metacarpals and that proximal phalanges, or each individual phalanx, is called the metacarpophalangeal joint. Now as we move into the fingers, just looking at each of the four fingers, not the thumb, we also have what we call an intermediate or middle phalange or phalanx, and the joint between the proximal and middle phalanges is called our proximal interphalangeal joint. If we were looking at the thumb in this situation, we have our proximal phalanx, and then we have a distal phalanx, and because it only has one interphalangeal joint, we call this joint on the finger just the interphalangeal joint. The most distal portion of the fingers is called the distal phalanx, and between the distal and intermediate or middle phalanxes, we have the distal interphalangeal joint. So we then number the fingers as we look at them from 1 up to 5. The thumb is always number 1 and the little finger is always number 5. And as we're referring to the digits, we refer to them in that way. We also refer to the metacarpals and the phalanxes or phalanges in this way. And the other issue, and again, we talked about this briefly in class, there's a nomenclature clash. So when we talk about the whole finger, we're talking about a phalange, or if we're talking about multiple proximal phalanxes, we would call them proximal phalanges. If we're referring to one individual phalanx, so if I'm talking about the proximal phalanx on the first finger, I call it a phalanx instead of a phalange. We have three kind of areas within each of the phalanxes and the metacarpals. So the most proximal portion of the bone is called the base, the middle section is called the shaft, and the most distal portion is called the head. And that's the same for each of the metacarpals and every phalanx. Moving on to the carpals, the first thing you need to do when you're looking at the carpal bones is determine if you're looking at an anterior or a posterior view. And the easiest thing to do for me is to look for the pisiform. So if you can see this small round bone that's beside the ulna, you know that's the pisiform and you're looking at the anterior side. And if you're looking at the posterior side, you'll see the pisiform still, but it's kind of wrapped around and hidden in front of the terquetrium. So that's kind of where I go, or how I start. I always look for the pisiform. You can also kind of look for the hook of the hamate. It's a little bit harder to see in a lot of pictures, but it's right here. And so if you can see the hook of the hamate, you know you're looking at the anterior view as well. So in this picture, we have an anterior view on the right and a posterior view on the left. Easiest place to start is to locate the scaphoid. So the scaphoid is the largest of the carpal bones, and it's always on the radial side, and it's kind of shaped like a peanut. So looking at the posterior view, here's our scaphoid, and here on the anterior view. So if we move medially from there, again thinking in anatomical position, the next bone that we see is the lunate. It's right here, and it'll be right there looking on the posterior view. So again, it's right beside the scaphoid, and it's kind of right beside that distal radio-ulnar joint as well. Again, that's the lunate. Moving medially one more time, we have the triquetrium, and again, it's hidden posterior to the pisiform. So looking from a posterior view, it'll be more anterior. And anterior to the triquetrium, we have the pisiform. We called those four bones the distal row. So moving on to the proximal row, we'll start back over on the lateral side by the scaphoid. So here we have the trapezoid, be right here. Moving medially again beside the trapezoid, we have the trapezium. Next we have the capitate, which is also very large, and it sits right at the base of our third finger, and capitate. And then the final bone is called the hamate, and again this is the one that has the hook on the front that we can see right here that your ulnar nerve passes through. So to go through the carpals one more time from an anterior view, again we know this is anterior because we have the pisiform, and it's on the anterior side of our triquetrium. So here we have the scaphoid, then we have the lunate, triquetrium, the pisiform. Moving back over again to the radial side, we have the trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and the hamate. Looking from a posterior or a dorsal view, again we start with the scaphoid, and then we have the lunate, triquetrium, pisiform, coming back to the radial side, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. Looking at the ligaments of the wrist and the hand, around each one of the fingers we have a joint capsule, and this is consistent again around all of the metacarpophalangeal and interphalangeal joints. And then we have across our metacarpophalangeal joints here we have what we call the deep transverse metacarpal ligaments, and those essentially hold our four fingers together and they limit our abduction. So it's there to prevent our fingers from spreading out too much and essentially tearing the webbing in between our fingers. We also have, and you can't see it very well on these pictures, but on either side of each of our metacarpophalangeal and interphalangeal joints, we have medial and lateral collateral ligaments. So we have little ligaments on the medial and the lateral side that prevent those valgus and varus forces that we talked about. We also have the deep flexor tendons that are coming down, and we'll talk about those when we get to the muscles. And we have a ligament that runs along those as well and kind of covers them. And we'll talk about that when we get to the muscle itself. Looking at the ligaments in the wrist, we have, again, we're looking at the anterior side where we have the pisiform. So this view is anterior on your top left. We have what we call the palmar radio-ulnar ligament that sits over our distal radio-ulnar joint. And then we have the palmar radiocarpal ligament. And this is kind of a three-part ligament that runs from the radial styloid and it attaches to the carpals. So again, it's kind of like the UCL in that we have three parts to it and they all run different directions. Again, that's the palmar radiocarpal ligament. Looking at the posterior view over on the top right, we also have dorsal radio-ulnar ligaments that sit on the posterior side of the distal radio-ulnar joint, and then we have a dorsal radiocarpal ligament. Then we have a radial and a lateral collateral, a radial and an ulnar, collateral ligament. So here's the radial side, so this is the radial collateral ligament. In the ulnar side, we have the ulnar collateral ligament. So in between each of those little carpal bones, we also have intercarpal ligaments, both on the palmar and the dorsal side. And then between each of the carpals and the metacarpals, we have palmar metacarpal ligaments. and palmar carpometacarpal ligaments. So in between each of the metacarpals, we have these palmar metacarpal ligaments, and then between the carpals and the metacarpals, we have palmar carpometacarpal ligaments. And then the same thing on the dorsal side. We have dorsal metacarpal ligaments and dorsal carpometacarpal ligaments. Moving into the muscles, we're going to start with the extensor group. The extensor group has 4 muscles in it, and we're going to start with the extensor carpi radialis, longus, and brevis. So starting with the extensor carpi radialis longus, it originates on the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus. So again, we're moving back up across that elbow joint, and we're on that ridge that runs down the side of the humerus. So looking from a posterior view, we see it on that lateral side, originating from that lateral side of the humerus, and then it comes down and it inserts into the base of the second metacarpal. So base meaning the most proximal portion, again, of that second metacarpal. Extensor carpi radialis brevis also originates on the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus, and then it inserts onto the base of the third metacarpal. Both of these muscles are innervated by the radial nerve, and they help to extend the wrist and abduct the wrist, or cause radial deviation, and then they also assist or are a synergist for elbow flexion. The extensor carpi ulnaris is the third extensor in our extensor group, and it originates from the common extensor tendon that's coming from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So our extensor carpi radialis, longus, and brevis came from that supracondylar ridge just above the lateral condyle, and they kind of combine with our extensor carpi ulnaris, and we create kind of this group tendon. So at the bottom of the extensor carpi radialis, longus, and brevis tendons, we call this common extensor tendon, and again, it's coming from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and that's where this extensor carpi ulnaris originates. It inserts onto the base of the 5th metacarpal. It is also innervated by the radial nerve. And like our other extensors, it causes extension of the wrist, but because it inserts onto the base of the 5th metacarpal, it causes ulnar deviation or adduction. The last extensor in our extensor group is the Extensor Digitorum. So this originates also from the common extensor tendon on the lateral epicondyle, just like we saw with extensor carpi ulnaris. Extensor Digitorum inserts on the 2nd through 5th fingers and onto the middle and distal phalanxes. So it kind of inserts into what we would call this extensor sheath, and it runs the entire length of both of those phalanges. So again, just the 2nd through 5th fingers. It's innervated also by the radial nerve, and it causes extension of the 2nd through 5th fingers and also helps with wrist extension. So looking at the extensor bundle as a whole, again, remembering that these are all coming from the lateral epicondyle, so always on the thumb side of the humerus. So here is where we have our extensor carpi radialis longus, and then underneath that our extensor carpi radialis brevis. Over on the other side we have our extensor carpi ulnaris, and then through the middle we have our extensor digitorum. So when we're determining which of these muscles we're looking at, we can look at a couple different things. We can memorize the order that they're coming off of the lateral epicondyle, and we can also look at where they are inserting to. So remember, when we look at our extensor carpi radialis longus, it's inserting onto the base of the 2nd metacarpal. So if we can kind of follow this most lateral muscle down, and it's a little bit tricky because it dives underneath other muscles, we see it inserts onto the 2nd metacarpal, and then we really can't see where the extensor carpi radialis brevis inserts. It kind of dives underneath of our digitorum, so we know that it's just medial to our longus. Then the next muscle as we move medially is our extensor digitorum, and this guy can look deceiving like it's 2 muscles, so it's always important to remember that you have to make sure you follow tendons down onto each one of the fingers, because our tendon and our muscle that's coming down onto the 5th finger kind of blends in with that group, or doesn't, blend in well with that group. So keep in mind that that's part of the extensor digitorum. And then the most medial, we have the extensor carpi ulnaris. So if we look from a lateral view, This becomes a little bit tricky, especially because on here we can't see necessarily where all the muscles are running to. So this muscle right here is our extensor carpi radialis longus, and then the small one just deep to that is our extensor carpi radialis brevis. And then we have our extensor digitorum, and just on the other side of that we have our extensor carpi ulnaris. And then this muscle that you can see here is the anconius. The extensor indicis is the extensor muscle for our index or our second finger. It originates on the posterior surface of the distal shaft of the ulna, and it also comes from the interosseous membrane. And it inserts into the tendon of the extensor digitorum around the second metacarpal, and kind of where the metacarpophalangeal joint is. So as the extensor digitorum tendon is crossing that metacarpophalangeal joint, the extensor indicis tendon joins it. Like all of the other extensors, it's innervated by the radial nerve, and it causes extension of the index finger as well as helping with adduction of the index finger. So switching over to the anterior side of the forearm and looking at the flexor group, first we have our flexor carpi radialis, and it originates from the common flexor tendon on the medial epicondyle. So just like we had that the common extensor tendon on the lateral epicondyle, the medial epicondyle has a common flexor tendon. It inserts onto the base of the second and third metacarpals. It is innervated by the median nerve and causes flexion and radial deviation of the wrist, as well as helps with flexion of the elbow. Flexor carpi ulnaris has two different heads to it that we have to consider. So it has a humeral head and then it has an ulnar head. So you can see the humeral head here, and then the ulnar head runs along the medial surface of the ulna. So the humeral head also comes from the common flexor tendon on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, just like flexor carpi radialis. While the ulnar head comes from the posterior surface of the proximal half of the ulnar shaft. Both of these heads insert onto the pisiform. Flexor carpi ulnaris is innervated by the ulnar nerve, and it causes flexion and ulnar deviation of the wrist, as well as assisting with elbow flexion. The last muscle in the flexor group is the Palmaris Longus. The Palmaris Longus is the muscle in the tendon that if you press your thumb and your pinky finger together over your palm, it'll kind of pop up right in the middle of your wrist. And this muscle originates from that common flexor tendon, again on the medial epicondyle, and this picture shows that really well. So all of those muscles originate coming from the common flexor tendon, but it's right off that medial epicondyle. It inserts into the flexor retinaculum on the front of the wrist, as well as the palmar aponeurosis. It's innervated by the median nerve and causes flexion of both the wrist and the elbow, and also helps to tense the fascia that sits over the palm, or that palmar aponeurosis. And we can see kind of the example of what that would look like here. And so that helps to tense that, which again helps with flexion of both the wrist and the elbow. We have two main muscles that help to flex the fingers, and the first one is the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, and then we also have the Flexor Digitorum Profundus. So the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis is the larger but also shorter of the two flexor muscles. So it originates from that common flexor tendon as well, but it also comes from the ulnar collateral ligament, and then comes from the coronoid process on the ulna and kind of the posterior side of the shaft of the radius. So it has a really large origin, again coming from all three of the bones in the elbow and the forearm. So this muscle comes down and it splits into 4 different tendons, and these tendons insert on the 2nd through 5th fingers on the medial and lateral side of the middle phalanx. It's innervated by the medial nerve, and it causes flexion of the 2nd through 5th fingers at the metacarpophalangeal joints and proximal interphalangeal joints. So it's important to remember with this one that because it inserts on that middle phalanx, it cannot cause motion at the distal interphalangeal joint. So the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis can only cause flexion of our metacarpophalangeal and proximal interphalangeal joints, as well as flexion of the wrist. Flexor Digitorum Profundus is the smaller of the two flexors, but this is where the flexor tendons run all the way to the distal phalanx, so it helps to cause flexion at the distal interphalangeal joint as well. It originates from the anterior and medial surfaces of the proximal 3/4 of the ulna. It also splits into 4 tendons, and then it inserts into the distal phalanges on the palmar surface. It's innervated by the medial and ulnar nerves. And just like with the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, it flexes the 2nd through 5th fingers, but this time we see the metacarpophalangeal, proximal interphalangeal, and distal interphalangeal joints being flexed, and it also helps with wrist flexion. When we look at the flexor group, again, remember that we're identifying the muscles that are coming from the common flexor tendon on the medial epicondyle. So that's always where we're going to start. We also have our bicep retinaculum coming down, and then over on the lateral side, we have our brachioradialis that kind of mixes in with these muscles as well. So the first thing that I typically do is looking down at the bottom, I'll start with the tendon. So right here, we can see that Palmaris Longus tendon. So I'll start with the Palmaris Longus, and then I can identify my Flexor Carpi Ulnaris and Flexor Carpi Radialis. So our Flexor Carpi Radialis is right to the lateral side of the Palmaris Longus, and then we can identify again that this comes down into the wrist and it inserts onto the radius, and then just to the medial side of our Palmaris Longus, we have our Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. So this here is our Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. And these are the most superficial of the muscles. So going from medial to lateral, we have Flexor Carpi Ulnaris right here, Palmaris Longus, Flexor Carpi Radialis. Now deep to those is where we have our other flexor muscles. So this gets a little bit trickier. So immediately behind that Palmaris Longus, again, our Palmaris Longus is right here. Immediately behind that, we have this muscle that looks like it kind of has 2 heads. So we see this portion and this portion. That entire muscle is the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, because we have the piece that's coming up from the ulna and humerus and the piece that's coming from the radius. It looks like 2 muscles, but that kind of group of tendons right there, those 2 tendons, create the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. Digitorum profundus sits underneath our Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, so from this view we really can't see it. We would have to look at a deeper view. So again, running through the muscles in this view, so looking right up at the top, this is our pronator teres. So we want to identify that first and remember that that's not a part of the flexor group. So then we again find that Palmaris Longus in the middle. To the lateral side of that, we have Flexor Carpi Radialis. Medial side, Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, and deep is our Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. And then on the most lateral side, we have our brachioradialis. Here we can also see our pronator quadratus running medial to lateral, deep to our flexor tendons down in the wrist. So moving on to the muscles of the wrist and the hand, these muscles we differentiate into what we call short muscles and long muscles. So we have short muscles that live just within the hand and they're intrinsic muscles of the hand, and then we have long muscles that go up into the forearm and then the tendons attach into the hand. So for example, our flexor and extensor muscles of the fingers would be considered long muscles of the hand. The Opponens Pollicis, like we're seeing here, would be considered a short muscle. So starting with the Opponens Pollicis, its job is just to perform opposition, so bringing the thumb over towards the pinky finger. It originates from the flexor retinaculum and the tubercle of the trapezium. Keeping in mind that the flexor retinaculum is the ligament that's running across the anterior side of the wrist, just like we saw on our last picture when we looked at all of the flexor muscles of the wrist. It's just a wide fascia kind of ligament that runs across the front of the wrist. And it inserts onto the entire length of the first metacarpal bone on the radial or lateral side. It's innervated by the median nerve, and again, it causes opposition of the thumb. The Adductor Pollicis is another short muscle or intrinsic muscle of the hand. It originates from the capitate and the 2nd and 3rd metacarpals, and it inserts onto the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb. Its primary action is to cause adduction of the thumb, but it also assists with flexion, and it's innervated by the ulnar nerve. Adductor Pollicis longus is one of the long muscles of the hand, while Abductor Pollicis brevis is one of the short muscles. So Abductor Pollicis longus originates on the posterior surface of the radius in the ulna as well as the interosseous membrane. It inserts on the base of the first metacarpal on the lateral side. It's innervated by the radial nerve and it causes abduction and extension of the thumb. Abductor Pollicis brevis, again, is one of the short muscles, and it originates from the flexor retinaculum, the trapezium, and the scaphoid tubercle. And it inserts into the base of the proximal phalanx on the anterior and lateral side. It's innervated by the median nerve, and it causes abduction and helps with opposition of the thumb. Much like the abductors, Flexor Pollicis longus and brevis have a long and a short. So Flexor Pollicis longus is a long muscle. Flexor Pollicis brevis is a short or intrinsic muscle. So Flexor Pollicis longus comes from the anterior surface of the radius and the interosseous membrane. And it inserts onto the distal phalanx of the thumb. It's innervated by the median nerve and it causes flexion of the interphalangeal joint of the thumb as well as assisting to flex the carpometacarpal and metacarpophalangeal joints of the thumb. Flexor Pollicis brevis has two heads to it. It has a superficial head and a deep head. The more superficial head originates on the flexor retinaculum of the wrist, and the deeper head comes from the trapezium, trapezoid, and capitate. And it inserts onto the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb. It's innervated by the median and ulnar nerves, and it causes flexion and assists with opposition of the thumb. Extensor Pollicis longus and brevis are both considered long muscles. The longus originates on the posterior surface of the ulna and their interosseous membrane. And it inserts onto the distal phalanx of the thumb. Flexor Pollicis brevis originates from the posterior surface of the radius and the interosseous membrane. And inserts onto the proximal phalanx of the thumb. They are both innervated by the radial nerve and cause extension of the interphalangeal joint of the thumb as well as the metacarpophalangeal and carpometacarpal joints. The lumbricals of the hand originate on the medial and lateral surfaces of the Flexor Digitorum profundus tendons, so they only deal with the 2nd through 5th fingers as such. They insert onto the dorsal surfaces of the phalanges into the extensor aponeurosis. The 2nd and 3rd fingers are innervated by the median nerve, while the 4th and 5th fingers are innervated by the ulnar nerve, and they help to extend the 2nd through 5th fingers at the interphalangeal joints and flex the 2nd through 5th fingers at the metacarpophalangeal joints. The palmar interossei originate on the base of the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th metacarpals. Insert onto the base of the proximal phalanx of those same fingers, so the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th proximal phalanx. It's innervated by the ulnar nerve along with the dorsal interossei, and it helps with adduction of the thumb, 2nd, 4th, and 5th fingers, all moving towards the middle finger. Then it also helps with flexion of the thumb, 2nd, 4th, and 5th fingers, and extension of the thumb, 2nd, 4th, and 5th fingers. The dorsal interossei originate on the shaft of all 5 of the metacarpals and insert on the base of the proximal phalanx of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers, as well as the extensor aponeurosis. It is also innervated by the ulnar nerve, and it works to abduct the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers at the metacarpophalangeal joint, as well as flex the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers at the metacarpophalangeal joint, and extend the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers at the interphalangeal joint. The Abductor Digiti minimi originates on the pisiform as well as the flexor retinaculum and inserts on the base of the proximal phalanx of the 5th finger on the lateral or ulnar side. It's innervated by the ulnar nerve and it helps with abduction and opposition of the 5th finger. The Flexor Digiti minimi brevis originates from the hook of the hamate and the flexor retinaculum. It inserts onto the proximal phalanx of the 5th finger on the palmar side. It's innervated by the ulnar nerve and helps with flexion and opposition of the 5th finger. Opponens digiti minimi comes also, like the flexor muscle, from the hook of the hamate and flexor retinaculum, and inserts onto the lateral, the medial aspect of the shaft of the fifth metacarpal. It's innervated by the ulnar nerve, and it causes opposition of the fifth finger. So one more time, we're going to run through the muscles of the forearm, both anterior and posterior, kind of in their entirety. So on the left, we have an anterior view, okay, so we can identify the bicep up at the top. Underneath the bicep, bilaterally, we can see little glimpses of the brachialis. Over to the lateral side, we can see the brachioradialis. Running underneath the tendon coming down from the bicep, we have our pronator teres. Okay, and then we get into kind of the muscles of the forearm. So again, we look at that flexor mass that's coming off of that medial epicondyle, starting in the middle, starting with our Palmaris Longus. And then to the lateral side of that, we have our Flexor Carpi Radialis. To the medial side, our Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. Deep to that, we have this muscle here that looks like two muscles, again, because we kind of almost have two heads on our Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. Okay, and then underneath all of these tendons down at the bottom, we have our pronator quadratus. Okay, and then the other muscle that kind of sits between our Flexor Digitorum Superficialis and then the Flexor Carpi Radialis tendon, so this muscle right here, that's our Flexor Pollicis Longus. So you can see it here and then down here. Looking at the posterior view, starting again up top, we have the tricep. Just inferior to that, we have the anconeus. And then looking up top, and this is a little bit of a tricky view, so this is our brachioradialis right here. And then if we move just medial to that, here we have our Extensor Carpi Radialis Longus and our Extensor Carpi Radialis Brevis. Okay, and then if we jump to the other side of the the extensor mass, here we see our Extensor Carpi Ulnaris. From here, we really have to look at the tendons to decide what we're looking at. So we can pick this large muscle in the middle, again, that has 4 tendons. So there we know that we're dealing with the Extensor Digitorum. If we look deep to that, we have these 2 small muscles over on the lateral side that are just going to the thumb. So the top muscle is our Abductor Pollicis Longus, and the bottom muscle is the Extensor Pollicis Brevis. And then kind of below that, we can see this long tendon. We'll have to go deeper to see the muscle. That's the tendon for our Extensor Pollicis Longus. So if we take a little deeper view this time, so we've taken off that top layer of muscle. So this would be the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis that's been cut. So underneath that, we have our Flexor Pollicis Longus. So it starts here and it kind of runs the entire length of our radius. So that's again the Flexor Pollicis Longus. And then our Flexor Digitorum Profundus is these 2 kind of groups right here. Okay, so our deep muscles are Flexor Pollicis Longus and Flexor Digitorum Profundus. And again, we just look at the tendons to differentiate which one we're looking at. So we know this is the profundus because the muscle inserts down on the distal phalanx. And then we know we're dealing with Flexor Pollicis Longus again because it's inserting on the thumb. Looking at the posterior side, again, making sure that we're looking at where the tendons insert will give us the biggest clue. So here we have our Extensor Indicis. We can see the tendon going down just onto the index finger. And then this group of tendons, we know we're just going onto the thumb. So automatically those are pollicis muscles. So again, we said the top muscle, and we can see it attaches kind of on the outside. It's our Abductor Pollicis Brevis. Below that, we have Extensor Pollicis Brevis and Extensor Pollicis Longus. And my apologies, guys, this top muscle is Abductor Pollicis Longus, not Brevis. Abductor Pollicis Longus, Extensor Pollicis Brevis, Extensor Pollicis Longus, Extensor Indicis.